Hi everyone, so let's talk about the recent PBD podcast regarding NATO, right? I saw a lot of misunderstanding regarding why NATO was formed, why it exists, and why it's relevant. So first, let's start off with the first point, which is that the US pays the bill. Now, there seems to be this misconception that somehow the US pays for NATO out of some altruistic goodwill regarding the Europeans and the European nations, because they want to be this benefactor that saves and protects the European people and countries. This is absolutely false, right? NATO was formed with three main points: keep the Germans down, keep the Americans in, and keep the Soviets out. Now, of course, the point about the Germans is no longer relevant given the current geopolitical landscape, but the other two remain true. So this whole narrative of NATO and the US somehow paying the bills out of some altruistic goodwill is absolutely false, right? NATO was the price paid for influence. It gave them the ability to project power into the Eurasian continent, into African excursions, bases, surveillance, everything regarding this framework. And the core idea was very simple. If you create an entire architecture of protection for the European nations, they can't have their own foreign policy. They have to align with the US, not only voting in international institutions, but the entire foreign policy regarding the Middle East or China, trade, everything is framed around the US positioning. So it gives the US complete dominance over the states and the ability to project power in the international landscape, not just regarding Eurasia and Africa because of bases and proximity and operations, but also influence in the global landscape. And so this is the price of influence. Now, you can argue that it's no longer relevant for whatever reason. You can put the pros and the cons aside and analyze, oh, we pay this is what we're getting, and you can come to the conclusion that this is no longer relevant and the trade-off is no longer worth it. But to say that and frame this as the US doing some sort of charity to the Europeans is absolute nonsense. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. No country does this, and especially not the US, right? So this is the first point. Now, the second point was regarding Trump's influence in the nation states that are members of NATO, paying for their proportion of NATO, right? And they framed it as this due to Trump's influence. But this is, well, there may be some truth to this. This is not the main reason. I'm going to put a similar graph that they put here, and you can see that the expenditure started in 2014. And one key information that is missing is that 2014 is when Russia took control of Crimea. So this was the big red alert for the European nations that caused them to start spending and increase spending in defense in general, because they saw Russia as a growing threat, right? Something that they hadn't seen in the years before. So that was the core reason. And next, the huge jump, which coincides with Trump coming into office, but it's not the main reason, is that Russia started the war with Ukraine, right? When tanks rolled into Ukraine, the Europeans went absolutely crazy and started increasing their expenditure and building up their armies. So this was the core reason why they increased their spending, not because of some Trump influence. That may have had a small part, some sort of influence, but it was definitely not the main reason. Now, you could argue that Trump had influence for a different reason, which is the absolute loss of trust from the Europeans in the US's ability and alignment with NATO, right? Their commitment to defending the Europeans. This was the biggest influence, if you want to call it that, and it made them lose absolute trust in the US. So if you want to call this influence, you can. I think it's a misconception and a wrong definition, but if you want to, you're welcome to. And they lost the complete trust in the US that they had for decades of the US stepping in to defend them. Now, I have to remind you that the only time Article 5 of NATO was in effect was when the Europeans united to help the US after 9/11. So this was the only time that it was ever in effect. And NATO is a defensive alliance. So they do not start wars. This is another point that I was going to get to later, but let's talk about it now, which is this war in Iran. The reason Europeans are not obligated and didn't want to help the US besides NATO. NATO has nothing to do with it. NATO is a defensive alliance. They only take effect when the Europeans or the US, anyone that's a member of NATO, is attacked. In this specific scenario, the US was not attacked. They attacked Iran, right? And you can argue that for strategic reasons. You talk to different people, they have different positionings. But the attack, of course, was initiated by the US. So they have no obligation, and it's not even the purpose of NATO to join this sort of conflicts, framing it in this specific mechanism that was in place in this recent war. So this is absolutely wrong. Now, the next key thing is that the Europeans are already preparing for a post-US period, regardless of the US leaving or remaining in NATO, right? I believe that probably the next presidents will want to maintain their commitment to NATO and to protecting the Europeans, but I strongly believe that the damage is done. I don't think the Europeans are going back. You can see the trends now. Germany, that kept itself down due to World War II and all the historical context there, they're now ramping up investments in their defense. They have become the largest ammunitions producers in the world. They surpassed even the US. Poland wants to have the largest land army in Europe. France wants to increase their nuclear umbrella across different European nations. So all these are happening because there's a complete loss of trust in the US. So I think it's a trend that will not revert. They want to take control of their defense, consequently of their influence in foreign policy in the world. So I think the damage is done there. There's no going back. So regardless of the US leaving or not NATO in the next coming years, I don't think it'll have a big impact, as long as it's not done right now in a huge chaotic manner, such as the withdrawal from Afghanistan, for example. But it's a trend that is not going back. Now, the next point I want to talk about is that NATO is not important anymore. Now, just to be clear, I'm Brazilian. I'm perhaps the most neutral point you can have in this regard. But from an American point of view, I think that's absolutely wrong. I think that for the long-term strategy of the US, this is absolute nonsense. It makes no sense whatsoever. The NATO not only allows US to control basically European foreign policy, but also project power into Eurasia, into Africa, and especially now that these are extremely contested regions because of the rivalry and the rise of China, right? And by leaving NATO and this whole crisis that you see with the Europeans, the issue with Denmark, Greenland, all of that, you're pushing the NATO allies to China, because the only rival that's, possible to take up the US's place in terms of trade and supply chains, etc., is China. So you're pushing them into basically the US's greatest rival at the moment, right? So I think from a long-term perspective, this is chaotic. It makes no sense, strategically speaking, and it will lead to a significant loss of influence by the US in the political and global landscape, right? In projecting power into the Middle East, into Africa, into Central Asia, and all of these contested regions, and even in the Asian Pacific, because the American allies see what's happening with the Europeans, and there will be loss of trust, and they will want to have their own armaments and not depend on the US, right? So I think it's a trend that will significantly reduce American influence. So, this is something to consider. Of course, everyone should make their own opinions. Is this a trade-off that is good for us, right? Pay less taxes, less expenditure in defense, less projecting power into the rest of the world. This is something only the American people can decide, if that's what they want, if that is the strategic goal that they want to pursue. Now, the last point I wanted to address was the claim that the Europeans sneaked a law into the US system to prohibit Trump from leaving NATO, right? I wasn't even going to address this, but since it was spoken, I'll address it. But this is absolute nonsense, right? It was a bipartisan measure by both the Democrats and the Republicans, both leaders who decided to work on this. And actually on the Republican side, it was led by Marco Rubio. So this whole idea and claim that somehow the Europeans and the globalists sneaked this into the US system, I think is absolute nonsense. The greatest likelihood was that these American politicians and lawmakers decided that they strategically are against Trump leaving NATO. So they made this measure together to prohibit and prevent this from happening. Of course, there must have been some influence from European representatives or counterparts who also see this as strategically terrible for both Europe and the U.S. But I think it's a consensus of both the U.S. and their European counterparts, and they together done this. But to claim that somehow they sneaked this into the U.S. system, whatever this is, absolutely false. I mean, there's no chance. It was debated, both sides supported it, so this makes absolutely no sense. Now, to finish this off, this is up to the American people. I'm not American. I don't have an opinion on this. And it's up to you to decide. You have to put in weigh the pros here, the cons, decide, analyze how much you're spending. What are the pros, right? What are you getting out of it? How are you projecting power? What are the Europeans doing in foreign policy historically that supported this decision? And analyze if it's still relevant. Perhaps you've come to the conclusion that it's not. Now, of course, there's the big risk from the American perspective that the Chinese will grow their influence with the Europeans because of this, and with the US reducing their influence in the Eurasian landscape. But it's a decision that the Americans have to make, right? And you, people voting, get to decide what to support, what to not support. So it's a decision that you have to come to at the end of the day. I'm just bringing the facts because what was said was absolute nonsense. I mean, I think there's a massive misunderstanding regarding NATO, but at the end of the day, it's up to you. So you make this decision and weigh the pros and cons and decide. But other than that, thank you so much for watching and take care. Peace.